So when I was in third grade, Loyal Elementary School, it was really close to our house too. You could walk out of our back door, across the driveway, across a street that two cars could get by, but it was tight. Then there was a 3-foot sidewalk, a little patch of grass, and a school. So I had no excuse missing. So lived really close. Third grade, Mrs. Toll's room. There was a big uproar, and at the time, I didn't fully understand it. I knew that there was this new show on TV, and I knew that something had happened with one of my classmates. So we're all out in the hallway, and we're lining the hall. Do you remember the drill when you had to do like a tornado drill or something like that? So we're lining the hallway, and this particular student gets called to the office. And then in third grade, I mean, isn't it crazy how quickly and how soon in someone's life gossip takes root? I mean, this guy gets called to the principal's office, and then we're all just like, zoop, we just huddle and we start, what's going on? Oh, it was his shirt. What did his shirt say? And then I just heard 2 words, Bart Simpson. And then I'm thinking, oh, that's the new show. And apparently this kid had come to school with a Bart Simpson shirt. And at that time, it was really risky, and I don't know the whole family life, home life or whatever, but his shirt had some very inappropriate language on it. So he was called to the principal's office, and his mom had to come and he had to change it. Long story short, my dad gets word of this, and he also gets word that this new show, The Simpsons, is starting to air, and he makes a connection. So Bart Simpson is off limits to me. He doesn't like anything that Bart says, especially this phrase, don't have a cow, man. My dad hated it. I wasn't allowed to wear any of the gear, really talk about Bart or anything like that. So fast forward till about 3 or 4 days ago, my family and I were over at the mall, and we go into this one store and we're just looking around, usually for something for Bella in this kind of store. But I noticed this clearance section, and I don't know about you, but I'm cheap. So anytime I see the word clearance, like I'm drawn to that. So I go to this corner clearance section and I'm just scanning through and I'm like, I need a new crew neck, and I flip and I see Bart Simpson. And have you ever had one of these moments where something just sends you back to your childhood? Just in a wave of nostalgia. I'm sent back to third grade and I'm thinking Bart Simpson, and I wanted to watch this show, and I didn't know what the inappropriate language was, but I remember seeing my fellow classmates' shirt and I wanted one so badly, but I wasn't allowed to have it. So I see this hanging there and I get one off, find my size, I pull one off the hanger, and I look in the back and it's not even Hanes. It's the Simpsons brand. So it's like real. And I'm holding this thing and it's on clearance and it's only $14. And I'm like, you can't get a new shirt for $14, an up-to-date shirt for $14. What is going on here? So I'm like, yes, I'm going to get it. And Michelle comes over. She's like, do you find something? I'm like, yes. And then as I say that, just like I'm haunted. And maybe you've been there. You've taken some stuff from your past, and it's like you've been able to compartmentalize it. So it's tucked away over here in this drawer of the past. And then something happens, and it's like that drawer is just pulled open, and you feel it. And usually it's thoughts or emotions. And if you're anything like me, you've got some stuff that just haunts you. It comes back and it makes you feel uneasy. So Michelle's like, did you find something? I'm like, yes. And I go up to show her, and I'm like, oh, wait, what if my dad sees this? Like, what if my dad finds out? And I know you're watching online right now, Dad, so don't have a cow, man. I mean, come on. It's okay, right? So I've got this, and this is the only time I will wear this out. You will never see me in public with this on. I will wear this at my house sometimes when I'm feeling rebellious. I'm going to wear this. Or, I'm just feeling like Michelle's taking too much control of the home. I'll wear this in rebellion, like I'm still the leader, something like that. But don't we all have those things that you forget about it, then it comes back, or something happened in the past and you thought it was dead? You thought it was done with? You forgot about that, and then something happens. Someone says something, you have an experience, and there's just this wave of memory or emotion. When you do a deep dive into the study of anxiety, you see that that's some criteria, especially if you have what's called an anxiety disorder. We'll get into that just a little bit. But if you have anxiety, which has become the number one mental health issue as we know it, isn't that crazy? Like over 40 million people wrestle with anxiety. And last week it was really interesting. I was wondering how this series was going to go, especially with us guys. I remember last week or the week before, Sean gave that speech about how we're going to have a sermon series on emotions. And I was like, no, Sean, don't tell guys we're going to talk about emotions. Our attendance is going to drop. So I was wondering how this would go. But after last Sunday, it was really interesting. My phone blew up. Text after text after text of people talking about things, asking questions, sharing some stuff they wish they would have come up and shared. Some people saying, I wish I would have met you at that cross. Here's what I really would like to talk about. And it was just amazing. So I think there's a great opportunity with this series, Haunted House, for God to do some really good work in our lives, especially if you wrestle with anxiety. And there's this really neat story in the Gospel of Mark that we're going to look at. It's from the life of a guy named Peter, Simon Peter, very popular character in the New Testament. There's this one section of Peter's life where the story's kind of rapid pace, and I bet it took a little bit longer to actually play out in the moment, but it's rapid, and you can kind of see anxiety's fingerprints all over this story. And you can see anxiety just ramping up. And actually, when you do some study with anxiety from a Christian perspective, this is one of the stories that is frequently referenced. And it comes from Mark chapter 14. As you're turning there, if you like to hold your Bible, if not, we got it on the screen, but as you're turning there, just let me note this. What's beautiful about this story is that Mark and Peter probably had some kind of really good working relationship. But there's some incident in Peter's life where he's alone, or he experiences something in his own world. And the only way we know about them is if they're shared. He opens up and actually shares this. So Mark just didn't do some digging and find this. Chances are Peter actually shares this with Mark. And you can make a case that Mark's gospel is actually the content of Peter's preaching, of his participation in the initial stages and developments of the gospel. That's powerful. And it's powerful for you and I because it just shows how much impact you and I can have, not only in our own lives, but the lives of other people when you decide to open up, when you decide to take a step forward and bring light into what's going on in your life, when you get that out, if you will, and you'll have an opportunity to do that here in just a moment. But we come into chapter 14, and what's going on in this scenario is that Jesus is on his way to the cross. He's headed to fulfill his redemptive purpose, and he's had some conversations with his closest followers about meeting the end, if you will. And they're still a little fuzzy, a little cloudy on how this redemption thing works. So Peter steps up and he was like, Jesus, there's no way we're going to let that happen. Jesus has to push back a little bit and say, no, this is supposed to happen. It's all good. We've been preparing this for some time. And then they get into this little dialogue, and Peter steps up and kind of rolls his shoulders back, and in a moment of confidence says, you know what? I'm with you all the way. And even if other people around us deny you, I'm with you 100%. And I will never deny you, Jesus. Whatever your fate, I'm going to be right there following you. And again, Jesus pushes back and says, well, calm down there, boy, because you don't know what the future holds for you very shortly. And they have this very familiar dialogue. And if you've been around church for a while, maybe you remember where Jesus and Peter talk about before the rooster crows, you will deny me. Or this is one of those passages that a lot of us learn in the King James Version. Like, can anyone quote the 23rd Psalm? Raise your hand if you know the 23rd Psalm. Okay, thank you for saving me, the 3 or 4 of you. You know the 23rd Psalm. You don't have to quote it. Do you know the 23rd Psalm? I bet you know it from the King James Version. I bet you don't know it from the NLT or the CEV. Well, this is one of those verses we kind of learned from the King James Version where you hear, before the rooster crows thrice, you know, that thrice word. So all that. So we usually learn it in that language, but that's what's happening. That's the setup in the story. Well, some time elapses and it's game time. It's that moment. It's climax. So Jesus goes and he gets arrested and it's all that, and all that stuff's about to go down. And then Peter's hanging back a little. Not in denial at this moment, but he's just hanging back. So some people, they kind of get a glance of Peter. It's like, oh, wait, we saw him early. And this girl speaks up in Mark 14 and she says, you were actually with that Nazarene Jesus. You were with him. And Peter's caught. Now, the text is going to not tell us that he's caught, but when you read the text, you get the impression he's caught. And maybe you felt that way before. Just like you've pulled the sweatshirt off the hanger and you're like, oh, yes. And then you feel, wait a minute. You feel caught. I'm convinced that anxiety has so much to do with identity. I'm so convinced that anxiety has so much to do with one's perception of one's identity. I just turned 46. A grown man standing in a store thinking, I hope my dad doesn't see this. Now, maybe that's not the actual setup for you, but I bet you've got a comparable story where anxiety, worry, has a little bit to do with your identity. So Peter responds to this in a caught way. She knows who he is, and now the denial starts to seep in. So Peter says, no, and he denies it. But notice the text here. In denying it, what actually happens? And I think this is amazing how the text delineates this denial. So Peter denies it, and then he says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand. And then he leaves. Isn't that a great definition of anxiety? You're in a moment and you lose focus. Now you're unsure. Maybe now you are a little confused, even if it's self-induced. And the most logical thing in the world for you to do is to leave. That's what's happening. So you'll read the word anxiety or anxious multiple times throughout the New Testament. And usually the word that we use to translate from the original language into English is merimnao. And that actually means a focus on a part instead of the whole, where something is divided into parts and not in a positive way. This is where we would get the phrase, you just went to pieces. And one of my favorite definitions of it, it's like anxiety is this thing that grabs you by the collar and it twists and it pulls you so close that you can't see the bigger picture. So you're only focused on a part. So in this moment, Peter goes to pieces. He starts focusing upon a part, not the whole redemptive story. And that's a good point for you and I. When we leave a building like this, because there can be a vibe, there can be energy, this can be empowering to be in a setting like this. And then we leave and life kicks back in. And the hauntings start happening. And you start focusing upon a part, not the whole of what God is doing in your life. That's why how you think about this, it's critical. So I want you to just hear scripture for a moment. This is one of the passages, Philippians 4 references anxiety. So I just want to allow the word of God to speak into this room for a second and allow it to hit you however the Holy Spirit wants it to hit you. But just listen to this language, because the way you're thinking about your life in any given moment is critical to any changes that need to take place or any forward steps that you need to take. So listen to this language. This is Philippians 4, verses 6 through 8. Do not be anxious about anything. And I don't know about you, but when I read a verse like that, my first thought is, easier said than done, right? I mean, how can I just, boom, I'm not anxious anymore? Like, is that even possible? But the text goes on faithfully. So do not be anxious about anything, but here's what you're going to do to battle anxiety. In everything, holding that shirt, thinking about, no, I wasn't actually with him, or the story you would share, the context that you are in everything, by prayer, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Don't allow anxiety to pull you away from what is most important. The focus has to be upon the Father, even in the moments where you're unsure of your next move. So, with present requests to God, and when you're able to get that right, when you're able to get that turning, then the peace of God, which transcends understanding. It doesn't make sense. This whirlwind you are in currently, and you're still at peace, it transcends human understanding. That's one of the promises that you and I have as followers of Jesus, that regardless of the circumstance that may or may not change, he has the capacity to bring in stability into our lives. That's amazing. And I bet some of you could share some really powerful stories of how peace has been a part of your life, regardless of what's causing anxiety in your world. So, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and it will guard your minds in Christ Jesus. It's not just going to hit you here, it's going to make sense up here as well. Well, how do we get that emotion again? Well, he goes on, he says, so whatever, and he lists this several times, whatever is true. Don't fall into the false reality game. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about those things. Don't get so caught off guard that all the negative is all you think about. So the negative is what you nurture. Instead, the positive, the good that's happening in your life, those other parts, the whole, if you will. Think about that stuff. That's how you battle anxiety as a follower of Jesus. And then that peace starts to seep in, and it starts to guard our hearts and guard our minds. This is why I'm telling you, I think, so convinced anxiety has a lot to do with our identity, or at least how we perceive our identity. So the story goes on. You can just see anxiety going, just blowing up, if you will, in Peter's life here. So the story goes on. Some more people come in contact with him. They're like, no. You are that guy. We saw you. And not just her, we saw you. So the text says, so Peter started denying it, and then he says some things, and he denies it again. And that's one of the things about anxiety. When you study anxiety, it can be what we call acute or chronic. It can be situational or it can be perpetual. And if it's acute, then it's situational. It's something happens and that causes anxiety for you. It's very specific, if you will. There are people, there's places, and there's positions you are put into that just wreak havoc in your life. Acute anxiety. And then there's chronic anxiety that's perpetual. Any situation can cause anxiety to just flare up in your life and knock you off balance. So my question for you that you don't answer out loud, which is true for you? Is it anything and everything right now that's just got your attention and causing you to go to pieces? Or is it a certain place, certain people, or certain positions you're in? It's just causing you so much stress, worry, and fear that anxiety is taking over. And some stuff is haunting you. That shouldn't be. That's where you can get into the story, because that's exactly what's happening here. But it goes on. So somebody else comes along. Maybe there's some more people or a group forming around Peter now. And they're like, we are convinced you're that guy who was with him. We know for a fact that you were with Jesus. And notice Peter's response. So Peter begins to call down curses in denial. This is wreaking so much inner turmoil that he's starting to curse the entire situation, possibly even himself. And I have to tell you, if you love good, deep, rich Bible studies, I can give you some literature that makes a case that in this particular context, Peter is actually bringing or trying to call down curses toward Jesus to separate himself from him. If that's not going to pieces, what is? So when you think about anxiety being wrapped up in our identity, here's what we mean by that. Several weeks ago, we had a great Wednesday night class, just super good involvement and participation with those who showed up, and it was about managing conflict. One of the things we underscored was the idea of personhood. So you think about this circle here, and that's me, and for you, right? We're using the word me. This is about the me that you really want to be, and that circle represents your personal space or your personal boundaries. And it's simply this idea that you fully understand where you end and someone else begins, or where someone else ends and you begin. You've got those clearly defined boundaries. But if you're going to pieces and you're focused on a part, not the whole, well, chances are you're not going to have the right kind of disposition in different relational dynamics, and it's going to cause you some inner turmoil, probably anxiety, maybe even to the point of where you're saying some stuff you shouldn't be saying because you are literally going to pieces. So one of those things is submission. And submission, when we talk about it being a relational submission, isn't really, the negative isn't really that biblical idea, that Ephesians 5 dynamic. This is more where over time, you've been in some kind of relational dynamic where you do not feel empowered to share your ideas, your opinions, your beliefs, or your understanding. There's been some kind of toxic nature or dominating dynamic going on to where you just let people invade your space. And over time, what happens? You lose yourself. And then there are times where you're the person who you don't respect the boundary of someone else. You have no idea where you end and someone else begins, so you just push through and you breach those boundaries verbally at will. It's like the center of the universe is all revolving around you. Now, what we want to do is we want to reach a point to where we're not filled with aggression or submission, but assertion. So in any given moment, any given circumstance, with any given group of people, we are who we are really supposed to be. You know, there's several people that I've been in mentoring situations for a couple of them for years. And it's kind of turned into a little bit of a joke. We'll talk about different things going on in our lives. And usually when there's a hiccup or a hang up that happens and it's causing some anxiety in the other person's life, I will look across the table and I'll say, what a fantastic opportunity. What a fantastic opportunity for you to be who you need to be in this moment. And I tell them that because I do that myself. When I'm in a situation and I'm extremely uncomfortable, when I'm in a situation and I'm not sure how this is going to unfold, what the outcome is going to be, when I'm in a situation and I'm just unsure of myself, I remind myself, who is it that David Green really needs to be in this moment? And I adjust real time to meet that moment. What if Peter could have done that? Wouldn't that have been awesome if he could have made those adjustments in the moment and said, yes, this is who I am. But instead, he goes to pieces. Now, here's what I want us to do with the rest of the time we have left. I want you to do one of two things. I want you to lean in one of two dynamics. And if these two things don't apply to you, all good topics like these don't always apply to everyone in-house. So if these don't apply to you, free time. Get out your phone, play your favorite game, It's all good, no worries. You come back next week, maybe that's for you, okay? So one of two things for you. Here's your two options. When I'm thinking about Peter and his role, we can't forget that this is the same Peter who sometime later locks eyes with Jesus, and they solve this. And at the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus actually does what we call, he restores Peter. And some time goes on, and Peter is present. Not only present, he preaches the very first recorded sermon in the book of Acts that launches the church. And not only that, as the church is up and going and expanding, and local churches are popping up in different areas, Peter actually writes two of our New Testament letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. And I'm telling you that because if you're someone who's filled with anxiety, that's not your identity, because there's hope and there's healing for you and a much better future. God can do some really good work in your life in the next few moments that empowers you to take your next steps forward as a follower of Jesus. That's exactly what happened with Peter. So here's the two things I'm talking about. One, some of you need to let go of some stuff and embrace a totally different opinion or disposition toward others or even what's going on in your world, your sphere of influence. And then some of you, in just a few moments, we're going to give you this option every week during this series. Some of you need to take the steps that some people took last week and meet me over here at the cross so that we can pray and we can give some of this stuff to God so that you can have that lifted and begin moving into your God-directed future, okay? Before we get there, we took a brief trip up to New York just about a week ago, just for a couple of days, and we get to New York, we go into the bus, we stayed in Jersey, we go to the bus, we get to the bus station, we come out ground level right there in Times Square. And for me, I love busyness. I'm a type of guy who, when I need to be calm and relaxed, I turn on some classical music, but it's the remix stuff, where it's just tons of sounds and it's quick and it's just bumping, and that soothes me. So when we stepped out onto the sidewalk there in Times Square, it's dark, there's lights, there's energy, everything's going on. I'm in love with it. Well, Bella, not so much. It was a little bit of a culture shock for her. Sophie's having a great time, Bella not so much. So we start talking about what we can do, and Sophie's like, I want some Wingstop. We don't have Wingstop back home. Can we get Wingstop? So we find a Wingstop, and we're like, yes, we'll go there. But eventually what we found is that this was their favorite spot, a little rock in Central Park where we could just see the backside of some of these buildings. So we went over there 2 or 3 times and just chilled for a couple of hours, took some snacks and goodies, and this was their just favorite place of New York City. Can you believe it? A rock. A rock. So we've got rocks back home. You know, we've got rocks everywhere. We have hiking trails and mountains and everything. We don't have to drive 10 and a half hours. We have this, but we had a blast. But anyway, back to Wingstop. We go into this Wingstop, and I didn't know this. I've never been to New York. So the door has this thing on the top. And when you push the door, I guess because of the way they've got the traffic of customers coming in and out, and DoorDash is like crazy there. So you push the door, and then the door automatically opens. I didn't know that. So I pushed the door, and I'm a fast-paced guy. The door didn't open in 0.1 second like I expected it to. So I press again, and I feel the resistance because of this thing. So I push a little more, and then the door jars, and then it hits this banister over here. Well, 2 guys turn around, and they look, and I thought they were looking at us before we walked in. So I'm the dad, and I'm a little, just making sure that I'm covering everything and all the bases and making sure my children are safe and all that stuff. So when this door hits, this guy looks at me, and we make eye contact again. I think it's going to be over. So he's like, wow, you made your entrance, didn't you? And I'm like, this Kentucky boy is about to go off on this. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And I'm thinking like this, and I happen to glance over to see where my girls are, and Sophie is staring at me, waiting for me to make eye contact, and she goes. So we get back to the place where we were standing, and she was like, listen, we're in New York. We're in New York. Don't do that. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know who'll do what. Don't do that. And I'm like, all right, and thank you for looking at me, calming me down. I appreciate that. When Peter writes his 2 letters, he gets really practical, like real-time scenarios where they just catch you off guard. And maybe you feel knocked off balance. And what should I do? And for some of you, it's a level of worry or fear or anxiety, or you're just unsure about your next step. When Peter is writing his first letter, I'm so convinced that he remembers Jesus. He remembers Jesus that night that he betrayed and denied him. He remembers Jesus just going willfully into the will of God. And he writes these words. He says, it's amazing that when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. And when he suffered, unjustly by the way, he made no threats. You know, some of us, we're a little high-strung. And when something doesn't go our way, our default disposition is to retaliate, to threat, to stand up to what's wrong. And some of us, when we're filled with those moments of anxiety, we need to just back off. Because right before this, he said, when Jesus suffered, he left you an example that you should follow in his steps, not retaliating, not making threats. And maybe that's what some of you need to give up. Because when you go to pieces, you start to lose control. And that's not what we want.